to start us in the spring of 1855, when a Turkish coffee house opened at 625 Broadway in New York City. This is always everyone's favorite. This is 625 Broadway today. Chipotle is not in the spirit of what I'm going to be talking about today. So from the street, walkers by would see window displays stuffed with Turkish dresses, leather slippers, water pipes, and other bazaar-like offerings. To travel to Constantinople, they simply had to enter the saloon. Inside, patrons could experience a range of food and baubles found in Constantinople itself. Even kebab, pilaf, and kofte could be had if ordered one day previously. To guests, the waiters were said to speak French, the language of diplomacy, quote unquote, and to the proprietor, they were said to speak their own language, presumably Turkish. So to put it simply, the Turkish coffee house in 1855 collapsed an Ottoman space and an American space and made them one. But the impression of Ottoman authenticity here was a fragile one, and we can see this in a newspaper account of Bayard Taylor's visit to the Turkish coffee house, which was picked up in papers as far as Ohio and Indiana. Now, Bayard Taylor, this guy, was the most well-known poet-traveler of the era. I wish I lived in an era where poet-traveler was still an occupation. He had spent the first half of the 1850s in Ottoman Egypt, Palestine, Asia Minor, India, China, and Japan, and published 3 books on his travels after returning to the US in 1853. He also embarked on a 2-year lecture tour, speaking on topics such as India and the Arabs. And he returned from his travels an enthusiast. As you can see, he donned a white turban, a full beard, airy Arabian pants, and he regaled the American public with stories of rummaging through Ottoman cities, blazing across their golden deserts, and sailing down the ancient Nile. So it's only fitting that in 1855, Taylor goes to the Turkish coffee house. But the coverage in the newspapers of this encounter was not an ode to cross-cultural interaction. It was instead a humorous reflection on the various claims to Ottoman authenticity on display in the brief engagement. The story noted that, quote, a great trouble is experienced by visitors to the coffee house to make the waiters understand their wants, for as they, the waiters, are dressed in Turkish costume, they take it for granted that they speak the language of the Turks and no other. The story then relays that when Bayard Taylor happened into the coffee house, he was anxious to try out his Arabic and asked the waiter in that language for a cup of coffee. All he received, however, was a look of stupid astonishment. Chagrined that he could not make himself understood through a language in which he took so much pride, the piece notes, he ventured to ask in English, "What's your name?" "Patrick Mulroney, Your Honor," replied the waiter as his eyes brightened. After that, Mr. Taylor took his coffee in quiet. At first glance, it might not be clear in the story who is the object of ridicule. Who is at fault here for the impression collapsing? Is it Oskanian, the proprietor, for trying to dupe his clients? Is it Bayard Taylor for taking the scenario too literally and being too prideful about his questionable Ottoman language skills? Or is it, as the story's headline called him, the, quote, Irish Turk, for being an Irish Turk? So to answer this question, to understand why this is so funny, we need to understand who the proprietor was, what he wanted to accomplish through his establishment, and how authentic representation operated at this time in the US. So now to the topic of my book and the rest of this paper. The proprietor of the Turkish coffee house, Hachi Christopher Oskanian, was born in 1818 in Constantinople. He was an Armenian Orthodox Christian who converted to Protestantism sometime after the arrival of the American missionaries to his city in 1831. With their help, Oskanian came to the US for the first time in 1834 to attend what is now NYU. And throughout his career in the US, he became well known across the country as, quote, the Oriental lecturer and the Turk. He even wore his fez throughout his life in the US. Now, for most of his career, Oskanian used a wide variety of pursuits to try to, quote, correct erroneous impressions of the Turks and cultivate what he called mutual diplomatic relations between his two countries. Through his efforts, he sought not only to create a friendly relationship between the US and the Ottoman Empire based on mutual understanding between equal nations, but also to promote paths to political reform, such as equal rights for all Ottoman subjects within the Ottoman Empire itself. So the Turkish coffee house, as well as attempts in 1856 and 1862 to install a Turkish bath in New York, which, let's think about this. 1862 is the middle of the Civil War, and Oskanyan's like, let's try to make money for raise a Turkish bath. So that's him. Anyway, they were at their most idealistic, Oskanyan's attempts to facilitate conversations between Turks and Americans, to enable travel without traveling, and to place Americans and Turks on equal footing. They were textbook third places, this term that you probably know, coined by sociologist Ray Oldenburg to describe non-home, non-work spaces that are vital to democracy. The coffee house, of course, was also an exponent of an Ottoman coffee house tradition, which everyone here knows about. But Oskanyan worked across a range of media and genres beyond the brick and mortar. Lectures, books, periodicals, photographs, tableaux vivants, object displays, comic opera in the 1890s, and personal costume. Taken together, his corpus of work allows us to inscribe third place with a double meaning. In what I call his third place diplomacy, Oskanyan transcended like an east-west binary by imagining and presenting images, arguments, and spaces that could not usefully be called either fully Ottoman or fully American. Nor were they simply Orientalist or self-orientalizing. That is, they were not representations in which a Western or Westernized eye rendered an Eastern subject static, exotic, violent, barbaric, and or hypersexualized to prop up its imperial power. Rather, Oskanyan's visions were a third thing entirely. Intentionally hybrid productions that he wanted an American audience to see simultaneously as familiar, corrective, and authentic. These efforts were not a wishful attempt to put Ottomans on par with Americans, but a self-assured effort to depict and enact a relativism in which neither American nor Ottoman practices were shown as superior, and to make the equality of Ottomans and Americans legible to his American audiences. But now, understanding Oskanyan's political vision and diplomatic philosophy is only the first step in starting to understand the joke with which we started. Third place diplomacy could only be operational, let alone effective, if American audiences experienced Oskanyan's renderings as authentic. So what makes something authentic in the US at this time? In the early 1860s, as this ongoing civil war captured the attention of every level of American society, Oskanyan developed and presented entertaining and instructive lectures on the domestic manners and costumes of another country entirely, Turkey. To illustrate his lectures on the women of Turkey, he employed a troupe of costume models, all women and one black man. And by the end of 1863, he was advertising for these lectures with increasingly spectacular language. The Grand Turk and his harem of Circassian slaves are coming. A marvelous exhibition and lecture given by C. Oskanyan the Turk, accompanied by his Turkish ladies and their sable guardians. So someone asked earlier about non-Muslims playing Turkish playing Oriental earlier, and this he certainly was. These lectures represent the height of Oskanyan's popularity. Now, Oskanyan was popular because he was both entertaining and credible, and he was credible because his expertise was underpinned by his various claims to authenticity, such as being a native of Turkey. Similarly, his advertisements claimed that the Circassians in his troupe were, quote, undoubtedly the most beautiful women ever seen in America, and were formerly Circassian slaves in Constantinople, where they were selected for their surpassing beauty to bring to this country to illustrate his lecture. Now, it's hard not to become suspicious here. How accurate were Oskanyan's performances? Did he really lecture with real Circassian and Turkish women, or were his models simply Irish Turks with whom he was effectively duping his audience? And yet, I contend these are the wrong questions. As we will see, Oskanyan's audience perceived his performances, and especially his living illustrations, as both authentic and representations. They saw his images as both a conceit and a type of the real thing. The impression of authenticity simply depended on Oskanyan doing it well. This was a way of seeing in many ways conditioned by the dawn of photography in the 1830s. Now, in the thick of the American Civil War, Oskanyan releases an album of 23 carte de visite photographs of men and women in Ottoman costume. At this very time, newspapers and photographers were teaching Americans to discern truths in the war photographs of Matthew Brady and others, and abolitionists were using photography to reveal the unseen horrors of chattel slavery to a northern audience. In other words, photography promised a superior grasp of reality. And Oskanyan used the promise of photography to animate his product and underwrite his claims to Ottoman authenticity. So we can look quickly at some images from the album. This is Mr. Oskanyan, the Oriental lecturer in citizen's costume. It says the portrait represents him in the costume of a civilian, so it's representing him. You can see here, that's Under's hand from when he sent me photos of the album many moons ago. I wanted a little shout out. Can you wave to the people? So that's the Armenian girl, the hand, exactly. Here's a collection of, part of my collection of CDVs I've been collecting over the year, cartes de visite. Oscanians, you can still find them on the internet and such. They're like playing cards for people who are Ottoman American enthusiasts like us. And so, yeah, you can see here again the citizen's costume. So while we today might think of authenticity and representation as being opposites, Oscanian's audience could see the authentic, the real, in a representation. Now, it's of course easy to understand that a photograph is a representation, or that a model in the photograph is representing a type of person, but an American public at this time could consider representation itself to be in its own way authentic, as something that they could look at and say, this is as good as the real thing. A viewer, in other words, enters into an act of co-creation or collaboration or co-production with the producer to, in this instance, create a third hybrid Ottoman American space and render a representation sufficiently convincing or convincing, authentic enough. The process was thus. Oscanian needed to produce representations that would be seen as authentic by an audience who might not know what was actually real or accurate. At the same time, this audience had their own ideas of what real was, as well as an internal code of what they might find believable, but for which they might not have the words, right? So to accrue the legitimacy and credibility of being seen as authentic then, Oscanian has to appeal to and satisfy this mysterious and mutable audience need while also seeking to insert his own authentic additions on his own terms to educate, correct, and or depict Ottoman American equality. In short, an authentic Ottoman American representation was not what we might assume it to be in our contemporary understanding. It had a logic entirely of its own. Now, Oscanian's Oriental album was both a traditional and a novel way of conveying an authentic Ottoman world to a curious audience. Ottoman costume albums were a popular staple of Ottoman and European book production, which the attendees, particularly in this room, know well, so I'm not going to address this at length. The salient point here is that Oscanian did not just replace the traditional painted and printed images in his costume album with photographed ones. Rather, he used photography to make a range of political points, leveraging this perceived truth-telling power to pursue this third-place diplomacy. So specifically, Oscanian uses the uniform imagery, or, quote, standardized compositions of the carte de visite genre. These standardized poses, such as leaning on a pillar, became the mode of representing the respectable body, a body that became recognizable and powerful, not by marks of individuality, but by its reference to a particular segment of American society identified by posture and props. By 1865 in the US, critics were already complaining about the repetition of photographers' 2 or 3 standard poses. They were bored. But Oscanian utilized the effect of the familiar, the repeated, the boring to make an ingenious point. In posing a costumed Turkish lady of rank or Armenian girl, in effectively the same familiar, boring position as a typical American subject, Oscanian rendered the Ottomans the same and equal to the typical American portrait sitter. He depicted his Ottoman subjects as normal, as civilized. Now, this method is particularly compelling when we realize that his standardized, boring images appeared in sequence with more unusual imagery, such as the photograph titled Oriental Worship, in which the Turkish lady of rank, I believe, is depicted in the act of Muslim prayer. So one can imagine that the idea of the Turkish lady's normalcy, depicted in the standard portrait pose, was intended to transfer over to and infuse the image of her engaging in what Oscanian's audience would otherwise consider an infidel practice. Now, of course, this equation hinged on Oscanian's models being able to convey a sufficiently convincing degree of authenticity, from face to dress. So what did an American audience find convincing and why? Oscanian's image of a Circassian slave girl reveals how this quality of authenticity was in part a question of contrast. So the Circassian slave girl was a figure that we've already mentioned as a key component of Oscanian's lectures. This group knows the Circassian slave figure well, so we'll just say that for Americans, Oskanyan's evocations of the Circassian slave girl tapped into an existing fascination with white female slavery, related sexualized imagery, and thus leveraged a familiar American trope to attract an audience. But while he certainly utilized the encoded language of the Circassian slave, Oskanyan's images and descriptions were not particularly salacious or exploitative. They were still intended to transmit information about the Ottoman Empire and to convey the ideal of authenticity. To put it another way, Oskanyan was attempting to correct an erroneous impression by using the same visual language of the fantasy itself. He wanted to critique but not disrupt the imagery that would appeal to his audience and scan as familiar, thus authentic and convincing. So to this end, the Circassian slave girl, did I not? Oh, there she is, yeah. She was depicted in a quite natural manner and chaste manner. Now, Oskanyan's efforts to depict authenticity through gentle revisions are also highlighted by the following comparison to P.T. Barnum, America's most renowned and notorious innovator of 19th century spectacular performance. Now, historians credit P.T. Barnum with first introducing live Circassian beauties to the American public in 1864, when he added Zuluma Agra to his American Museum and began distributing her images on carte de visite. Sarah Lewis has recently argued that Barnum used this Afro-approximating hairstyle to mimic the headgear of male Circassian warriors and frame his Circassian beauty as a, quote, doppelganger for the well-known wartime Caucasus resistance leader Shamil. Now, while Lewis claims that Barnum created this figure to lampoon, quote, the unstable foundations of racial hierarchy, i.e. the idea of Caucasian whiteness, it seems more likely that Barnum intended to mock the incompatibility of the two dominant Circassian figures at this moment, the Circassian freedom fighter and the Circassian slave girl. And in mocking and combining popular ideas, Barnum's constructed Circassian beauty was one of a series of these liminal figures that Barnum marketed to captivate and provoke an American audience throughout the century. Through these kinds of images, Barnum sought to encourage viewers to develop questions and interpretations for themselves as a means of entertainment. This was an immensely effective tactic, though criticized. Barnum was known across the decades as a purveyor of humbug, but because of this, he was incredibly popular. So to this point, no one has noticed that Barnum's Circassian was informed by Christopher Oskanyan. Oskanyan launched his living illustrations of Circassian slavery at least a year before Barnum took up the form. And Barnum was a member of Oskanyan's audience. In early October of 1863, towards the end of a year of repeated Women of Turkey lectures, and not long after Oskanyan's Circassian slave girl image was first published, P.T. Barnum made Oskanyan an offer to work for him after having seen him perform. But Oskanyan declines. It was the next year, in 1864, that Barnum came out with his own Circassian beauty. And decades later, a contemporary of the two men in New York entertainment scene even revealed that Barnum actually consulted Oskanyan on the entire and name of his first Circassian figure. And fun fact, a lot of people quote this source, but they leave out Oskanyan's name. They just say a Turk in New York was consulted. So I went back and found the original, and lo and behold, Oskanyan's name is in the original. So given the relationship between the two men, it is telling that Oskanyan turned Barnum down. While Oskanyan may have been willing to lean into tropes to attract an audience at this time, he wasn't willing to abandon the ideal of authenticity or the credibility that came with it. To affiliate with the inauthenticity of Barnum would not in any way help Oskanyan achieve his goals of rendering Ottomans and Americans equals and determining the political future of Turkey. Alas, Oskanyan was living and working in a Barnum world. He was also operating in an economy of detection. His audience had been raised by phrenology, by the Fugitive Slave Act, we can go on, to understand that modern life meant regularly asking, how do I know what I'm seeing is real? So Oskanyan was taking a risk in using this kind of implicitly hybrid imagery in a world where audiences were encouraged to find this kind of mixing humorous, if not transgressive, and where they were primed to look for deception. So a case in point, in 1868, Oskanyan fails to impress the good people of Des Moines, Iowa, with his harem of, quote, live women. At Oskanyan's lecture, the women on stage were easily identified by the local audience as waiting girls from the principal hotel of the city, uncommonly Scots-Irish in appearance. A newspaper report noted a great deal of the Oriental loveliness was lost in the palpable prevalence of fact over imagination. Whatever his abilities in culture, the correspondent continued, Oskanyan was capable of out-Barnuming Barnum in humbug. So after so intentionally separating himself from Barnum's deceptive presentation style, he was nevertheless deeply susceptible to being painted with the same brush. Clearly, his audience felt deceived and duped. Had they not understood the conceit? But wherever the fault lay, the result was the same. Oscanion's representations were not authentic enough for his audience, and he slipped unwillingly into being received as a hoax, as a purveyor of humorous hybrids of Irish Turks.